Hey Art Nerds! A few nights ago, I hosted a watercolor workshop here on the channel where I showed you guys how to use watercolor and watercolor markers to paint a beautiful water lily. This water lily came from the Bergen Water Garden website. I highly recommend you check it out. They sell all sorts of water plants for your home needs. So I started with this inked sketch of a water lily referenced from that photo. My art nerds have access to the line art. They can download it, they can print it out on watercolor paper, and they can paint along. And this is a time-lapsed shortened version of the workshop that we held live here on the channel. So if you want to, you can draw along or you can utilize the line art that I have here. I also have it up on Gumroad. By purchasing it, you're helping to support what I do here on the channel. So I wanted to get started with some watercolor to just kind of lay the foundation down. So I'm using the Core Mini Palette. This was painted in a Canson XL watercolor sketchbook, and it was inked with Sakura Pigma FB and Pentel pigment brush pens. So we're starting by applying some cool yellow with a little bit of phthalo blue. That's what makes that really fresh blue-green color. I'm going to link the full workshop for you guys down in the description below. I answer all sorts of questions. We do some demonstrations. We talk about all sorts of other things. So if you're looking for more information or a more complete walkthrough, that might want to be the direction you want to go in. Now, the reason I'm using watercolor for this stage is I really want to get this nice wet into wet diffused blend that's sometimes a little bit more difficult to achieve with watercolor markers. I also want to point out that in this tutorial we're going to be using pigment-based watercolor markers rather than dye-based watercolor markers. I do have some dye-based marker tutorials here on the channel if you're interested in learning more about those, and in the full workshop I do talk about and demonstrate the differences between the two marker types. So there is some gold in that workshop that is well worth checking out, and I spend the first half of the workshop just kind of demonstrating and explaining the differences between the markers. So like I said, I'll link it in the description for you guys to check out. I'm allowing most of the color mixing to happen on the paper. That's going to give us kind of a light freshness. It's also going to add a little bit of unpredictability to it, which is what makes things feel more organic and more lively. Now I'm going in with almost straight phthalo blue to paint in some of the shadows on the water lilies. As with my origami tutorials, I'm painting the background first and then moving inward to the foreground. So I'm applying a wash of clean water to the body of the water lily, and this is going to really encourage wet into wet blending. I applied some cool yellow. I'm going to add in a little bit of pyrrole orange and allow that to just bloom out onto the paper. We're using cellulose paper today because it plays really well with watercolor markers and allows for direct application and is less likely to get torn up by the brush tips on the markers. Now I'm applying a wet loose wash of Quin Magenta and allowing it to kind of flow out, and I'm dabbing up the excess with a thirsty watercolor brush. Now, a thirsty watercolor brush is just a brush that's been cleaned, it's been dipped in clean water, and then you squeegee out the excess water from the bristles. And this is going to make the brush way more likely to absorb water and pigment than a dry brush. Now I'm going in with a bit more of the pyrrole orange into the center of our water lily. And I'm pretty much just using two watercolor brushes for this demonstration. They're both silver black velvet brushes. They're just good workhorse brushes. They're a combination of synthetic and squirrel hair. I'm going in with a bit more saturated Quin Magenta mixed with a little bit of Dioxine Violet. I'm trying to capture the freshness and the vibrancy of the water lily. Now I'm going in with just a bit of a stronger mix. So originally I wanted this all to be wet into wet diffuse blends, but because cellulose paper dries unevenly, some areas did dry before others, so I'm blending it out with just a little bit of clean water. Once the water lily has been painted, I'm going into the background and applying a mix of Payne's Gray, Burnt Umber, and a little bit of Phthalo Blue to start painting our water. And since it dried a little bit lighter than I wanted, I'm going in with a stronger mix and hopefully catching some areas while they're still wet so we can get some wet into wet going on here just to add some more depth and add some more contrast and shadow. Okay, so that is the base painting. Now we're going to be moving on to using our watercolor markers. And for today's tutorial, I'm using Winsor & Newton watercolor markers and Albrecht Dürer watercolor markers. The Winsor & Newton watercolor markers use similar pigments to Winsor & Newton watercolors, and the Albrecht Dürer watercolor markers use India ink pigment. So both of these are going to be more light fast than your dye-based watercolors. I have over to the side, you can just barely see it, a ceramic palette. And you can't see what I'm doing, but I apply a bit of the marker to the palette and I use that to help me apply lighter washes to the petals. Then I'm going directly in with the marker while the petals are still wet, and I'm doing a little bit of wet into wet. You want to be careful with this technique. If it's too wet, your marker is going to actually absorb the water and this can ruin the marker. So if that happens, you want to scribble it out until your full saturation returns. I also want to apologize. Some parts of this video did get cut out. That happens just because I'm recording a live stream. I'm not necessarily paying 100% attention to both cameras as they're going on because I was using a 2-camera setup for this. And sometimes the time just gets away from me and the camera stops recording and I forget to press record again. So we are going to have some sorry about that, stops and starts, but hopefully that won't be too distracting and the full live stream is available for those of you who want a more relaxed painting session. This has been time-lapsed by about 4, so if you're interested in seeing how long this takes about real time, it took about 2 hours to paint, with a lot of that just being dry times. So I'm working petal by petal, applying the lighter version of the color, the wash version of the color, where we applied the marker to our ceramic palette and then added some water using a brush. This is going to give us more organic shapes. It's going to feel a little less stiff than if we just used the brush itself. And then I'm using the brush tip to add a more saturated version of the color, then washing it out just a little bit to kind of help blend that transition. Just about finished applying that Quin Magenta. Next, we're going to go in with the Winsor Newton watercolor marker Dioxine Purple, and we're going to apply that along the edges of the petals. We're really trying to create a beautiful fuchsia color, and my goal was for these colors to kind of mix on the paper surface. So using a similar technique to what we used for the Quin Magenta, we apply our Dioxine Purple to our ceramic palette, add some water, and then apply it to our Waterlily. So at this point, I realized I wasn't really getting the color that I wanted. Initially, I grabbed one of the dye-based Echo Line markers because when you work with dye-based colors, you can get this really beautiful color vibrancy, but I didn't have quite the pink I was looking for. So I instead opted to switch over to the Albrecht Dürer watercolor markers, and I'm using the Albrecht Dürer Magenta for this right now. Similar application technique. I'm just trying to get more of that sort of bright, glowing fuchsia color. Now, I want to point out that we are working from a web-based, light-based reference photo. It is being lit by the screen. It appears to glow. Watercolor does not have that option. You can get these almost glowing watercolor effects, but often when you're working with watercolors that have pigment in them, you're not going to get the same vibrancy that you would get on a screen. So that's just something to kind of keep in mind. For me, I was chasing that rabbit through this whole piece, and it was starting to frustrate me until I had to remind myself that working from a photoshopped, color-corrected photo, you're not necessarily going to be able to capture that 100% perfectly, and it's really best just to focus on trying to capture the essence. So here and there, you guys also see me going in directly with the Faber-Castell marker. I like the brush tip on this marker a bit better than I like the Winsor & Newton brush tip, but I do want to point out, if you're working with watercolor markers on a wet surface, even a good brush tip may start to tear up, start to abrade the paper, because you're tearing up paper that's already vulnerable because water's been added. This doesn't happen with alcohol markers because alcohol evaporates much faster than water, so the paper is not going to be as vulnerable to abrasion. So if you start to notice paper pilling, that's a good time to take a break and kind of let the paper dry a bit and then come back to it later. Or it's a good opportunity to switch your painting technique. That's why I'm not just working directly with the markers 100%. They just have a high chance of tearing up the paper. That's why I've created a bunch of layers using watercolor first. And it's also why I'm applying my watercolor marker to the ceramic palette and then applying it to the flower. So for those lighter outer petals, I applied a little bit of cool yellow to my ceramic palette, painted that on, and now I'm going to go into the center of the flower and start adding more detail. Now I apologize because they are out of shot, but I am using the Winsor & Newton watercolor markers for this part. I've selected a warm yellow, 2 oranges, and a red to help build up our color, and I'm just going to do direct application for this. Another reason you might not want to do direct application from the get-go is, depending on your watercolor marker, some are not going to blend out the way watercolor would once you add water. Some of them are going to have a very harsh transition line, and this is something we talked about a lot more in the full version of the workshop. Dye-based markers are less likely to do this, but dye-based watercolor markers are much more light fugitive because they are dye-based, and they're going to be more water reactive. So at this point, I just wanted to go all in with our watercolor markers. So I'm using the Albrecht Dürer watercolor markers, and I'm doing a direct application. Then I am blending it out with some water on the paper. And for this, you want to work fast, because if you let them dry, they're not going to want to budge. So we're using a lighter, cooler green, this is like a spring green color, to add some more color to our lily pads. I also applied some Winsor & Newton blue, I think it's indigo here, to start creating darker shadows cast by the Waterlily onto the Waterlily pads. The yellows and the oranges that I applied to the center of the flower have had a chance to dry. So now I'm going in with the Winsor & Newton Cadmium Red Light, I believe, just to add some stronger orangey details to the background. And as that dries, I'm going in with indigo into the background water, and I'm just kind of creating some light striation. So I'm creating some areas of shadow. I'm also going in with sepia. So we're using indigo and sepia because I want to create that sort of murky pond water look that looks like it both has very dark blues and very dark greens and some browns all modeled into it. So at this point, I also want to point out, you guys are going to notice that I am primarily using the brush tips, not the bullet tips for both of these markers. For both of these markers, the bullet tip color is frequently quite different from the brush tip. I've talked about this in the Albrecht Dürer watercolor marker unboxing swatch. I've also talked about this over on the blog when discussing Winsor & Newton markers. I find that ink flow to the bullet tip, even if these markers are stored horizontally, is not as good as it is to the bullet tip. I've also discussed some ways I think these companies could address this problem. So as I'm applying these areas of shadow, I'm also washing them out with a little bit of clean water just to kind of get them to move and to kind of break them up, to get them to behave a bit more like watercolor. So watercolor markers do behave a lot like just plain old markers, just plain water-based markers. In fact, you can use Crayola Supertips as watercolor markers, and I have tutorials here on this channel where I talk about doing just that. So you can use them to create more graphic art, but this video was recorded by someone's request. They wanted to know how to use watercolor with watercolor markers, and I wanted to kind of demonstrate that. So now I'm going in with just a little bit of white gouache, just to add some white highlights here and there, just to add a little bit more white contrast, a little bit more lightness, and a little bit more pop. But all in all, I'm very happy with how this watercolor sketch turned out. I had a lot of fun painting this, and I had a lot of fun hanging out with everybody during the watercolor workshops. My online live streams are now on Saturday nights at 8 p.m. for the duration of the COVID epidemic. We're going to be hanging out, we're going to be chatting. I even turned my face cam on so you guys can actually see me, which is a little bit brave. I feel like I'm being a little bit brave putting myself out there like that, but I think it helps create a sense of community. So I hope you guys will join me. And if you guys enjoyed this video, please consider hitting subscribe and joining me for more watercolor videos.